The ranger station at Whispering Pines was an old, creaking structure. Wooden beams weathered from years of exposure to the elements, its windows fogged and cracked. As I stood at the entrance, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, as if the trees themselves were alive, leaning closer, watching. A strange sensation settled over me, the kind of feeling you get when you know something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. My first day on the job, and already I could tell this place wasn't like anywhere I'd ever been. I could feel the forest staring at me through the trees, dark and full of secrets. The head ranger, Miller, had greeted me with a stiff nod, barely saying a word. He was a wiry man, skin like parchment, his gray hair hanging in uneven tufts around his weathered face. He hadn't given me much of a tour, just handed me a piece of paper and pointed toward the bunks. His silence had unnerved me, but I chalked it up to him being one of those old-timers who'd seen too much in his life to bother with small talk. I sat on the edge of the bunk, unfolding the crumpled sheet of paper Miller had given me. It was a list of rules, and not your typical no smoking in the cabins type. These were strange. Rule 1. If you're out in the forest and you see the shadow of a woman in the darkness, immediately close your eyes and count to 10. If she's still there when you open your eyes, run back to your vehicle and pray she doesn't follow. You don't want to know what happens if she follows you. Rule 2. Never answer any phone calls or radio transmissions while on patrol, especially if the voice on the other end claims to be a lost child. It's a trap, and if you respond, you'll become the next target of the forest's malevolent entities. Rule 3. If you find a clearing with a perfect circle of dead trees, leave immediately. Those who linger too long in these cursed grounds are never seen again, and their screams echo through the night. Rule 4. Should you encounter a visitor with pitch-black eyes and a sinister smile, do not engage with them. Slowly back away and report the incident to your supervisor. These entities are known to prey on the minds of the weak-willed. The list went on like that, 20 rules in total, each more bizarre than the last. At first, I thought it was some kind of initiation prank, like hazing the new guy. But as I read through them again, that sense of dread I had felt earlier started creeping back into my chest. The rules weren't funny. They were unsettling, filled with the kind of specifics that come from experience. When I reached the bottom of the page, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a small arrow drawn in pencil, pointing to the back of the sheet. My curiosity piqued. I turned it over, expecting a joke or a final punchline. But what I found sent a chill straight through me. Rule 21. Do not listen to Ranger Jack. We've never had a ranger here named Jack. Ranger Jack is a demon, and if he manages to tell you the stories of all 20 rules, he will take your soul. My heart skipped a beat. I read the rule again, convinced I had misunderstood, but the words were there, as clear as day. I laughed uneasily, telling myself it was just another part of the hazing, a story to spook the new guy. But deep down, something wasn't sitting right. The way the words were written, the finality of it. It didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a warning. A soft knock on the door snapped me out of my thoughts. "Ready for your first night, rookie?" a voice called out, friendly and warm. I looked up and saw him, Ranger Jack. He was standing in the doorway, smiling, dressed in his standard-issue ranger uniform, a mug of steaming coffee in one hand. His smile was wide, friendly, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. They were too bright, too eager, and something about the way they locked onto mine made me feel like I was being pulled into some kind of invisible trap. "Yeah," I said, standing up quickly and trying to shake off the unease. "I was just going over the rules." Jack's smile widened, his teeth white and straight. "Good. Those rules will keep you alive out here." He chuckled softly, but the sound made my stomach turn. I wanted to say something about Rule 21, but my throat felt tight. The words lodged somewhere between my chest and my mouth. Instead, I just nodded, forcing a smile as Jack motioned for me to follow him. As we stepped out into the night, the air was thick with fog, the trees looming overhead like skeletal giants. Jack led me down the dirt path toward the clearing where the other rangers were gathered around a small campfire. The flames danced and flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor. As we approached the fire, the others greeted me with curt nods and quick glances, their faces barely illuminated by the orange glow. I could feel their eyes lingering on me longer than they should have, like they were assessing me, judging whether or not I belonged. Jack sat down on one of the logs, gesturing for me to take a seat beside him. I did, though every instinct told me to stand, to stay on my feet in case I needed to run. The fire crackled and popped, sending embers spiraling into the sky as Jack began to speak. "So," he said, his voice low and smooth, "you've read the rules, but there's a story behind each one. You'll understand them better once you know where they came from." The other rangers remained silent, their faces expressionless, eyes fixed on the fire. Jack's gaze shifted toward me, and I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine. His smile was still there, plastered to his face. But now it felt like something else, something darker lurking just beneath the surface. I shifted nervously on the log as Jack began to tell the first story, Rule 1. His voice was captivating, hypnotic even, and despite the gnawing fear in my chest, I found myself leaning in, hanging on every word. But as the story went on, something strange began to happen. The forest around us grew darker, the trees seeming to close in, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The wind howled through the leaves, but beneath it I swore I could hear whispers, faint and distant, like the forest itself was listening to Jack's words. I wanted to run, to get up and leave, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't tear my gaze away from Jack's face, his too wide smile, his too bright eyes. And all the while, Rule 21 echoed in my mind. We've never had a ranger named Jack. By the time Jack finished the story, I could barely breathe. The fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced and twisted like something alive. The other rangers didn't react to the story. They just sat there, staring blankly into the flames. Jack's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind them, something dark and malevolent. His smile widened. "There's more where that came from," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard, my throat dry. I couldn't stop thinking about Rule 21, about what it said, and what it might mean. My heart pounded in my chest as Jack leaned closer, his eyes glinting in the firelight. And all I could think was, how many stories had he already told me? The fire crackled softly as Jack's voice lulled me into a trance, his smooth tone painting vivid images of the forest's terrors. I couldn't help but be drawn in despite the ever-growing feeling of unease. Something about the way he spoke made me feel like the words themselves were crawling under my skin, burrowing into my mind. I tried to shake it off, to focus on anything else, but his voice was relentless, constant and heavy. The other rangers sat unmoving, their faces locked in cold indifference. Their silence gnawed at me. No laughter, no shared glances, just vacant stares and stiff postures, like they were puppets waiting for their strings to be pulled. The sense that I didn't belong, that I wasn't meant to be here, rooted itself deep in my chest. I glanced around, searching for an escape, but the night pressed in from all sides. The trees seemed even closer now, towering like great sentinels in the gloom, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes against the black sky. I could swear I saw faces in the shadows, hollow eyes watching me from between the trunks. My skin crawled with the sensation of being observed, yet when I tried to pinpoint where the feeling came from, there was nothing but darkness and the unnerving stillness of the forest. Something wasn't right about this place. I could feel it, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain. It wasn't just the strange rules or the suffocating atmosphere. It was something more, something deep and ancient. Jack started on another story, this one about a ranger who'd gone missing years ago. His voice had dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, the firelight flickering in his too bright eyes. The name sounded familiar. It wasn't from the list of rules, but from one of the stories he'd told earlier in the night. I leaned forward unconsciously, trying to recall where I'd heard it before. As Jack continued, it hit me. The ranger he was talking about was the same one from a handful of the other stories he had shared. A shadow mentioned only in passing, but now Jack was giving them a name and a face. It was like unraveling a thread, and suddenly the stories started to weave together into a much darker tapestry. The ranger, according to Jack, had vanished without a trace after violating one of the rules. But that wasn't all. This ranger had been the head ranger, the one who trained everyone, Miller's predecessor. My stomach turned. No one had mentioned that before, and now it felt like a thread that was about to snap. I tried to focus on what Jack was saying, but my thoughts swirled with memories of the paper in my pocket. Rule 21. Do not listen to Ranger Jack. I suddenly needed answers. I had to know more about the other rangers. I glanced over at Miller, hoping to catch his eye, but he was staring into the fire, his face unreadable. He hadn't spoken a word since the fire was lit, and now I realized he was always keeping his distance from Jack. It was as though he was avoiding him. An unsettling thought crossed my mind. What if Miller knew? What if he had experienced the same dread, the same horror that was now worming its way into my mind? I excused myself quietly and slipped away from the campfire. No one seemed to notice, not even Jack, who continued his story without pause. My footsteps felt loud against the silence of the woods, the night swallowing me up as I moved toward the old ranger station. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Dust motes hung in the weak beam of my flashlight, and the wooden floor creaked underfoot. I made my way to the back office, the one that hadn't been used in years. Old papers and folders were strewn across the desk, some yellowed with age. I sifted through them, my heart pounding in my chest, hoping to find something that made sense. And then I found it. A journal, bound in cracked leather, tucked away in the bottom drawer. The name on the inside cover caught my breath. Ranger Lewis. It was the name from Jack's story, the ranger who had vanished. I flipped through the pages, scanning the entries, and what I read chilled me to the bone. Ranger Lewis had begun to suspect something was wrong at Whispering Pines long before his disappearance. The journal detailed strange occurrences. Ghostly figures in the woods, whispers that seemed to follow him wherever he went. And worst of all, stories that Jack told him, each one twisting something inside of him until his grip on reality began to slip. But the journal didn't end with paranoia or madness. Lewis had found out the truth about Jack. One of his last entries read, "He's not a ranger. He's not even human. Jack is a demon, and he's been here for decades, maybe longer. He feeds on our souls, one story at a time. And once he's told you all the stories, there's nothing left. You're his." The journal ended abruptly. The last few pages were torn out, leaving behind only vague smudges and the indentation of frantic handwriting. Lewis had never stood a chance. I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. Jack was no ordinary man. The pieces were all falling into place. Those stories weren't just warnings or cautionary tales. They were traps designed to ensnare. And I had almost walked right into them. Miller must have known. That's why he kept his distance, why he didn't speak much. But why hadn't Jack taken Miller? What made him different? I shoved the journal into my jacket pocket, a chill running down my spine. When I turned around, I nearly screamed. Miller was standing in the doorway, watching me, with those hollow eyes. "They're all still out there, you know," he said softly, his voice like a dead wind blowing through the trees. "The ones Jack took. They linger in the woods, waiting. But they can't be saved." What happened to you?" I asked, my throat tight with fear. He stepped closer, his face gaunt in the dim light. "He got me too," he whispered. "A long time ago. But he didn't take my body, just my soul. I'm a shell now, waiting for him to finish what he started." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why didn't you warn me?" Miller's eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite understand. Regret, perhaps, or maybe despair. "It wouldn't have mattered," he said. "Once you start hearing his stories, you're already marked. The only thing you can do is make sure he doesn't finish. He looked past me, toward the dark woods outside the window. They're waiting for you out there, he murmured. The ghosts, the lost rangers. They'll show you what happens when Jack finishes the final story. Before I could respond, a distant sound echoed through the forest, the unmistakable voice of Ranger Jack, calling out into the night. Time for the next story, he called, his voice dripping with honeyed malice. Miller gave me one last look, then stepped aside, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Be careful, kid, he said softly, because once you hear the last story, you're his forever. I burst out of the station, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the icy night air stung my lungs. The forest was eerily still, not a single sound breaking the silence except for the frantic pounding of my heart. Jack's voice echoed through the trees, his words slithering between the branches like a snake. Come back, Sam, he called out, the sweetness in his voice now thick with malevolence. Don't you want to hear the rest of the stories? I could feel the weight of the journal in my pocket, like an anchor dragging me deeper into the nightmare. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Miller's words haunted me. Once you start hearing his stories, you're already marked. My feet carried me deeper into the woods, away from the station, away from Jack's voice. The trees around me twisted and groaned, their branches seeming to reach for me with gnarled fingers. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that barely penetrated the darkness. Shadows danced on the edge of my vision, and I could feel the presence of something lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Watching. Waiting. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of mournful wails. And beneath it, I could hear them, the whispers. Faint at first, but growing louder with each step. They weren't just whispers of the wind. They were voices. Voices I recognized. The Rangers. The lost souls Jack had taken. Their words were unintelligible, garbled by years of torment and despair, but their tone was clear. They were pleading, begging. They wanted release. They wanted to be free from the forest's grip, free from Jack. I kept moving, my legs trembling with every step. The journal weighed heavily in my jacket, but it felt like a beacon now, something that might lead me to the truth. If I could just find a way to stop Jack, maybe I could end this nightmare for good. But Jack was relentless. His voice was closer now, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sam, he called again, his voice dripping with false warmth. You can't run forever. Come back to the fire. We're not done yet. I stumbled over a root and fell hard to the ground, my flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling away into the darkness. Panic surged through me as the world around me was swallowed by blackness. For a moment, everything was silent. Just my ragged breaths and the distant whispers of the damned. Then, a light flickered ahead of me. Not the cold beam of my flashlight, but a warm, orange glow. My heart sank. It was the campfire. I hadn't been running away from it. I'd been running straight toward it. A cold dread washed over me as I scrambled to my feet. The clearing came into view, the fire crackling softly in the center. And there, sitting on the log across from it, was Jack. He was smiling, just like always. That too wide, too perfect smile that never quite reached his eyes. The flames danced in his gaze, casting flickering shadows across his face. But it was what sat next to him that made my blood run cold. There, scattered around the fire, were figures, half-formed and ghostly, their faces twisted in agony. I recognized them instantly. They were the Rangers Jack had taken, the lost souls trapped in the forest, their features etched with eternal torment. They were staring at me, their hollow eyes filled with desperation. But that wasn't what chilled me to the core. Sitting across from Jack, a figure leaned forward, their face shadowed by the firelight. It was Miller. His expression was blank, his eyes dull and lifeless, the shell of a man who had given up, waiting for the inevitable end. And then, I saw it. The final seat around the fire. Empty. Waiting. I knew what it meant. That seat was meant for me. You're almost there, Sam, Jack said softly, his voice no longer pretending to be kind. It was cold now, dark and hollow. Just one more story. One more. and it'll all be over. I took a step back, my body trembling with terror. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees tightening their grip. I could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The lost rangers were calling to me, their voices laced with both warning and desperation. Jack's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've already heard 20, Sam," he said, his voice a whisper that carried on the wind. "What's one more? What's the harm in finishing the story?" The ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling me toward the fire. I tried to fight it, but my body wouldn't listen. The journal felt like lead in my pocket, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. I had to do something. I had to stop him before it was too late. But Jack was patient. He knew. He knew that no matter what I did, the end was inevitable. I fumbled for the journal, pulling it out with shaking hands. My mind raced, trying to piece together some kind of plan, some way to stop him. The pages rustled in the wind as I flipped through them, but the words blurred together. I couldn't focus. Jack took a step closer, his smile never faltering. "You can't fight it, Sam," he whispered. "It's already done. You're mine." Desperation clawed at my throat. The whispers were deafening now, the forest itself seeming to pulse with a dark energy. The firelight flickered, casting twisted shadows across the clearing. I looked at the faces of the rangers. So many of them. All trapped. All victims of Jack's stories. I couldn't let that happen to me. I couldn't let him finish. With one last burst of energy, I threw the journal into the fire. The pages caught quickly, the flames licking up the leather cover as the words inside began to burn away. For a brief moment, Jack's smile faltered. His eyes flicked toward the fire, and I saw something dark and sinister flicker behind them. Anger. But then, his smile returned, wider than ever. "You think that will stop me?" He laughed softly. "You think burning a few pages will change anything?" The fire roared to life, the flames twisting and contorting unnaturally. And then, without warning, they went out, snuffed like a candle. The clearing was plunged into total darkness, the air thick with silence. The shadows closed in, suffocating and cold. And then, Jack's voice, low and menacing, cut through the void. "The last story doesn't need to be told, Sam," he whispered, his voice crawling across my skin. "Because it's already being written." Suddenly, I felt it, an icy grip closing around my throat. I gasped, clawing at the invisible force as the air was sucked from my lungs. My vision blurred, and the ground seemed to vanish beneath my feet. The trees, the forest, everything disappeared into the black. And then I heard it, a voice, my voice, echoing through the darkness. "The final story," it whispered, "is yours." And with that, everything went cold. In the silence, I realized the truth. I was no longer running from the story. I was the story. And my soul was already his.